Now I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Jessica Zychowicz, who's director of Fulbright Ukraine and the Institute of International Education in Kyiv. She's currently in Warsaw. She was evacuated with her family when the US asked its citizens to leave. She's the author of a book on art, feminism, and revolution in 20th century Ukraine. She has authored numerous articles on gender, human rights, revolution, and protests in post-communist Ukraine. She's an alumna. She's a PhD from the University of Michigan. She worked with Ben Paloff. She was also working closely with me. So we're very glad to have Jessica and tell us a bit about academic leaders in wartime, the past and future of Fulbright Ukraine, but also telling us what she's seeing from Warsaw, as she's very deeply connected with people who remain in Ukraine and people scholars who are now refugees in different countries. Jessica, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you also, Brian, for your presentation. Good to see you as well. Yes, so I came to Warsaw on January 27, but prior to that, since November, I was working on evacuation contingency plans that I designed for Americans who were in Ukraine on the Fulbright program as students and scholars. I was working closely with the US Embassy Kyiv. I'm still in touch with them daily, as well as my local staff in Ukraine at Fulbright. All of them, 10 of them, remain in Ukraine. That is actually something I wanted to mention today too, is that a lot of people don't want to leave Ukraine. It's their home, and leaving is a dilemma. Our American Fulbrighters did not have a choice to leave or stay on January 27 when the first evacuation order went from DC to the Kyiv embassy, and that order was called, in diplomacy, it's called authorized departure. So diplomats could choose to stay or go, and families of diplomats had to leave. What was interesting about that moment was that President Zelensky of Ukraine, who I know in American media right now is very heroized, he politicized that a lot and said to US Embassy, you should not order your diplomats to leave because Ukraine is not a Titanic. And he said the same thing to other embassies who were evacuating at the time, that this was hysteria. And to the local population, he was also delivering the message, everyone needs to remain calm, this is hysteria. And up until the last day before the bombing on February 24, kids were in school, which is why I still have relatives in Ukraine. There was not a lot of messaging to the general population before the tragedy hit that people should be really preparing for wartime. Martial law was called on February 27, and this created conditions where men ages 18 to 60 and still men of that age cannot leave Ukraine. So a lot of the displaced people who are coming across the border right now are elderly or women and children. I'm, in conversation with all of our Ukrainian alumni who are collecting testimonials of their experiences in Ukraine, and I put a link to that in the chat for anybody who would like to read those firsthand, unmediated texts from very articulate scholars and students who are in Ukraine right now. Something that I think I would challenge everybody to think about is to ask yourself, is this a war or is this a revolution? Because the timing of this is also connected to the history of the Maidan Revolution in 2013, 2014, which I write about in my book. And since that time, a lot of the war that's been going on for the last 8 years involved the same struggle for the values on the Maidan that people are fighting for today on a more international level, with volunteers going into Ukraine to join the Ukrainian army from 52 countries. There are now 20,000 volunteer fighters going into Ukraine and joining the units there. Putin started bombing on February 24th, and the Maidan revolution in 2013, 2014 had the biggest life loss on that same week. This timing also gave Putin a green light to commit war crimes because he still had the rotating seat on the UN Security Council. And he started the bombing on the hour of the last meeting he was supposed to preside over. So there's a definite, kind of evil expletive that has been delivered just in the calendar of what is happening. I think also some, maybe knowledge I can add to our conversations today about discrimination and struggles among activists in Ukraine for anti-discrimination laws are also connected to 2013, 2014, and a kind of continuous struggle now that has gone to the level of, a more intense military combat. But in 2005, as early as the Orange Revolution, so Ukraine's had two revolutions since gaining independence in 1991. The Orange Revolution was very peaceful. The Maidan in 2013-14 was not. Both were connected to the fight for free and fair elections from a rigged election. And the first anti-discrimination law was put on the table in 2005. This was connected to gender equality. And then another one in 2012 that was part of the package for the EU association agreement that then Kremlin-backed President Viktor Yanukovych was supposed to sign. He said, not going to sign it. And this is what sparked students first to go out in the square in November of 2013. They were attacked by police. Then a lot of Ukrainians joined in on that demonstration. It was peaceful for a while from November until February, and then it became, violent revolution. Now, that law, after the revolution, anti-discrimination law, was revisited and it was signed, and it was one of the gains of the 2013-14 Maidan revolution. The other gain was a visa-free travel regime into Europe by Ukrainians going anywhere they want in Europe. So some, I think, of the campaigning we're seeing around the refugees, actually displaced people, because technically they're not refugees, they have a visa-free regime into Europe. Some of that is a kind of memory of what was considered a gain out of 2013-2014 revolution. Since 2013, 2014, even though the anti-discrimination law was signed and put into effect in 2018, there have been a lot of documented crimes, hate crimes by the far right. Human Rights Watch and also Amnesty International Ukraine have great reports that you can look at if you want to revisit that. But my area has really been studying feminism and gender, and in the last 2 years, I've been working on an anthology that will come out this year with 12 authors who live and work in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. And the Strike Kobiet feminist movement in Poland now has been silenced. Some activists from that movement worry that the refugee campaigning, as Brian Porter had mentioned, will give the current government another term. And for gender equality activists, it feels very tenuous right now if they're going to make any gains that they want. And Belarus also is silently occupied, and women who were part of the opposition there now, I think, are certainly in a position that is even more challenging. But I know this paints a very bleak picture of what may be lying ahead. And the title of my talk today is Academic Leadership, because in the past couple of weeks, I've been here in Warsaw with 14 American scholars and students who have mobilized with different organizations here and also have been using their writing skills to speak to media, to write letters to American Congress people. One of those people who you can write to right in your neighborhood is Marcy Kaptor, who is from Ohio and a very strong voice for Ukraine in American government. And she's also a friend of the Fulbright program. Our Fulbright program is going to remain open for Ukrainians going to the US, as well as Russians going to the US. Both programs will remain open, but Americans will not be coming to Ukraine or coming to Russia for a while, probably a year, maybe longer. And I think also it's important and interesting to think about education as a human right. And a lot of our Fulbrighters here who are working, with me on these different initiatives, we are working within our sector. So we're really targeting students who are displaced. There are international students, like we probably all have read about the 20,000 students from India who were in Ukraine and needed to evacuate. And they've had a harder time doing so because they didn't have their family networks behind them, and they didn't have Ukrainian passports. So to go to Poland was not so automatic for them. But looking at education as a human right, I work for an organization, NGO, IIE, the Institute of International Education, which started in 1917. Again, a revolutionary context that looked a lot like a war, because you had different military units and volunteer units fighting each other. And in Kyiv right now, you even have like an anarchist unit, and they see in Russia the imperialist invader, whereas the Ukrainian army maybe sees in Russia the neo-Soviet invader. So they see opposite things, but they're both fighting a unified front. And this looks a lot like 1917. At that time, IIE evacuated scholars, artists, and others in the creative and information, I guess you could call it information sector, including Marc Chagall, who was in Vitebsk. And the mechanisms and the values of our international academic community have been sustained for 100 years through all of World War II. IIE was working also throughout the region of Eastern Europe. And I've had to really gain strength from those lessons, because I am living in an Airbnb with my 2-year-old and 2 suitcases, and I left everything I own in an apartment I may not return to in Kyiv. And it's like that for a lot of people right now, not only Ukrainians, but Kyiv is a very international, globalized city with many companies, many initiatives, many organizations, and all of us had to leave. So the global impact here in the 21st century, I think, is going to be, in the short term, a lot of canceled projects, a lot of challenges, but in the longer term, I envision that more and more companies are going to locate themselves in Ukraine, potentially those who have left Russia, and maybe will recognize the high level of talent and innovation there. And right now, Ukraine is on the fast track to join the EU, which would provide, I think, an excellent kind of carrot on the stick for Ukraine to clean up its court system. The corruption there was, and still, is a kind of invisible war. And even before the bombing happened, the war that was going on for 8 years in Luhansk, Donetsk, and occupied Crimea, for many Ukrainians kind of became, I guess, a phantom limb and a source of a lot of pain and trauma, but also a desensitizing factor. So when the war broke out again at a larger scale, people were very shocked because they did not expect it coming. They had lived with a war already for 8 years and thought that this was going to be resolved or somehow contained in the East. And in that being said, I think, the scholars that I work with on the Ukrainian side, some of them work in Ukrainian government, and one of them, Zubrzycki, was actually part of drafting the constitution of Ukraine after the Maidan revolution in 2013, 2014. And it's not a finished draft. And it's one more reason why I would argue that what we're seeing right now is a continuation of that revolution that has never fully been, resolved. And even the courts were having so many problems because the Russian oligarchs were also controlling different members of the parliament and media. Just this past fall, a large conglomerate was frozen out of Ukraine by President Zelensky, and there was a big campaign to de-oligarchize Ukraine, which is what was happening during 2013, 2014, when Viktor Yanukovych was ousted. He's meanwhile waiting up in Minsk to take over Kyiv right now. So my friend here in Poland, she's Polish, she jokes that this is the finale in the Netflix series when the hacker group Anonymous joins with NATO and takes down Putin. And I would really love to see that end to this saga so I can go back to Kyiv and join my friends and family in Ukraine. So that's my report. And I would love to engage with anyone here who would like more resources. There are lots of lists of organizations you can engage with. I put a couple of them in the chat.
Thanks so much, Jessica, for the report and for what you're doing from Warsaw. I think it's very important. You mentioned, of course, that people will not be, American scholars will not be going on Fulbrights to Ukraine or Russia or anytime soon. So I'm wondering if you know if Fulbright will actually take those funds and reallocate them to Russians or Ukrainians wanting to come here. I mean, we're working hard at trying to figure out how we can bring as many people to give them as many opportunities as possible. So do you know if those monies will be reallocated to bring more people to the US?
Well, the way Fulbright is funded is year by year on a yearly congressional appropriations cycle. So annually, globally, if there are residuals, they will reallocate to different areas of priority, and Ukraine and Afghanistan are the top 2 priority countries. So if there are residual funds, they will be reallocated to Ukraine and Afghanistan. But in the meantime, IIE is doing emergency fund drive for Ukrainian students. They raised $600,000 in the first 5 days of the fund. So they're doing a great job. I anticipate that we will see more funding from ECA, Education Cultural Affairs Bureau, going to Ukrainian students and Russian students, but definitely I think the priority is going to be Ukrainian students ahead of Russian students. The Russia program shrunk a lot these past 2 years because of relations with the Russian government and the kicking out of the embassy several diplomats. A lot of Fulbright relies on relations with the host government. So hopefully relations with Putin will allow Russian students to come to the US, and Fulbright and IIE both recognize that citizens are not their government, and many citizens oppose their government. So closing that program in Russia would be a disservice to scholars there. And I also agree with that.
Right. Well, you have an optimistic take on what the future may hold that's very different than that of Yuri Zhukov or Dan Fried. So maybe what your optimism is closer to that of Yevgeny Albat's in a way, that there might be solutions to the conflict that could return to some kind of, but you know, not status quo, but peace or ceasefire. It's interesting also, okay, now I lost my train of thought, but
it would be interesting if somebody were to study the Russian defectors, because a lot of the fighters in the Russian army are deserting. There's been a lot of reports of that in the Kyiv Independent, which is a great resource for news. It's the spinoff of Kyiv Post, which is not good anymore, but that would be, I think, a way that this could end if more people deserted. There have been rewards set out by the IT sector to pay Russian soldiers who stop fighting, and Russian POWs are treated very well by the Ukrainian army. That's being documented widely.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at this point, I'd like to move us to the conclusion, and would like to invite you, obviously, Jessica, to remain, and Brian, and I know that Yevgeny Albat is still there too.